right, so this video is covering the concepts for phase two. And so in phase one, you were supposed to play around with the grid, just kind of playing around with the different parent rectangles and subdividing with different primary rectangles, playing around with diagonals, trying to find, subdivisions and so on. So in phase two, we are actually going to apply the grid to a real project. And you're going to remember that learning to use the grid is the purpose of the project. Okay, so that means designing the grid and using it is the process. And so you're going to be designing a booklet that has multiple chapters, and each chapter is going to cover, or you'll be using the content from one of the projects as the content for each chapter. Okay, and just to get used to working with the grid, you're going to be working with 3 different grids. I haven't decided whether we're going to do just 2 chapters or 3. I think we'll probably just do 2, only because we're getting a little crunched for time. So let's just say 2 chapters, and you'll be using 2 different grids, which means you'll be using 2 different parent rectangles, and that means no matter what you do, it's going to be different. And you're going to be subdividing those parent rectangles with a different primary rectangle, and then you're going to be finding the grid for that stuff. Okay, so you can use the golden section as a parent shape, but do not subdivide it with a square, and do not subdivide it with another golden section. That's problematic. Okay, so you'll have a minimum of 3 spreads, and each spread obviously has 2 pages, so it's a 6 pages total. You'll be experimenting with different layout variables. Okay, in other words, there's so many different ways of working with the grid, using different typefaces, different scale, different font weights, different placements, orientation. So there is a myriad of possibilities here that I want you to experiment with. In other words, don't settle down on one layout, because I will be mad. I want you to experiment. That's the beauty of this, because this is leading up to our final project, and the final project is a massively awesome project, as well as it's a massively awesome portfolio piece. And so the better you get at this tool now, the better you'll be able to handle that big project. Okay. Consider the continuity elements, like what we talked about in chapter 3. I mean, in project 3, where we were, thinking about shapes and color and textures and so on. These things that are going to hold the basic design feeling of the project together. You can even use the continuity elements that you used in the project as your continuity elements for the chapter. Okay, so these are some opportunities here. Again, I want to see different variations, adjusting the idea slightly. You don't have to save every small iteration. Okay, basically, I'd like you to try something, save it, play around with it, and really move some things around, and when it looks cool, save it again. So 2 or 3 variations for each grid, I think, would be fine. I think you're going to find that it's, the more you play with it, the more fun you're going to have. Okay, in other words, when the layout looks different, save it. Okay, you're going to you're going to select the strongest solutions for the critique, but I want you to upload everything. Okay, so here's what it looks like. Okay, so this is spread 1, this is spread 2, this is spread 3. This is the left page, right, left, right, left, right. Okay, so on spread 1, you're going to have, this is a typical project, so whatever you decide to do, whichever of the 2 chapters you want to handle, that's fine. I would probably recommend projects 2 and 3. I think there's the most content in those. But chapter 1 also has some good stuff, because you were playing around with black and white abstract designs and then applying those to real projects. So you have a lot of content there too. So I guess what I would say is I would pick the 2 projects where you have the most content. All right. So here, typical project, you're going to have just the grid with all the diagonals, so I can see how the grid is built. And then on the right page, you're going to have a project title. You'll have the grid, but you'll take the diagonals out, so you'll have just the grid itself. On the second spread, you're going to have a left and a right page. This is project content, and it will be based on the grid, but the grid will not be visible. And then on the third spread, again, it's basically the same spread, except that your grid will be on, but the grid will not have any diagonals, because I will have seen that, how it was built on this page here, so I don't need to see the diagonals here. And as a matter of fact, if you do, I'll be annoyed. Okay, so your contents include a cover, so the entire PDF document will have a cover that talks about project 4 and the dynamic grid and whatever, and we'll see some options for that. Each project will use a different parent rectangle. Each project will have at least 3 spreads: spread 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, and 3, and then remove the diagonals from the last spread. And also remove any divisions that you didn't use. Sometimes you create grids and they have a lot of divisions in them and then you don't use them. Just take those out. Okay, so that's the specifications for the project. This is what it looks like. So you'll have, this is spread 1, and here's the grid. It's a root 2 with the square subdivision, and then these are all the diagonals, and then all the grid lines, the divisions that you can find from those diagonal intersections. Here's the grid and what it looks like without the diagonals. It's flipped. Notice that the square is here and then the square is here. Okay, so that's when you're dealing with spreads, that's what you would normally do anyway. You would normally have the grid, and if it was an asymmetrical grid, you would simply flip it from that to that. Okay, so it has a title page for the project. So here's project 1, and then the name of the project itself. Okay, so then here, let me view single pages because she saved these as spreads. Okay, so here is project 1. This is the second spread. All content, no grid, right? So we can see how it looks and go, wow, that really looks cool. And remember that you should be working with scale. Some large things, some small things. That's the beauty of this grid, is it handles complex content really, really well. So your written content can be, in this case here, it was taken from my project sheet, and it's the goal of the project is what to do. You should have written a design reflection statement when you posted your finals on the Glass website, and you can use that reflection statement as your content. And then you can also create a document or a paragraph or whatever that talks about your process, how you started, what you did, how your design evolved, and so on. And then the last spread is with the grid on. And so again, remember to remove any divisions that you didn't use. It looks like she used most of these, and so I would say leave them all in. Okay. So in project 2, she chose a square subdivided by it looks like a root 3. Now remember that the page size is open. You can use whatever page size you want. It can be a square, it can be horizontal, it can be vertical, it doesn't really matter. But what you want to do then is set the grid inside of whatever page size you have. So the page size will be consistent, the grid size will not. So we can see even here, the page size was the same. It looks like she used a square, and the grid floats inside of that. And that gives you, large margins at the bottom, and a gutter that has a reasonable amount of space, and then small margins on the top and the left and the right. So those are all. I was looking for something here. No, that's all I'm looking for. I'm looking for that. All right, looking for that. Okay. So anyhow, long story short here, your next project 2 could be 2 or could be 3. Again, the grid, different primary rectangle. It's flipped, diagonals on the left, no diagonals on the right. The next spread has all the content on the grid, but the grid is turned off. I mean, and again, you should be working with typography, advanced type. You should be working with graphic elements. You should be thinking about continuity. So all of the things that you've learned up to this point, now you're going to apply those. So I think that's, one of the things that students often go awry on is that they get to something where it gets really complex and they forget all the stuff they've been working on for the whole previous part of the semester. And here's where you actually get to put it all to use. And so go back to those concepts that we studied on chapter 1, anomaly, concentration, repetition, and so on, and use those concepts as a layout guide, if you will. And then work with that, okay? And then, of course, here the grid is on, no diagonals, and we get to see, how it all works. All right? Same thing here, different, looks like a root 3 with a root 2. And then the grid is off. These are actually very nice grids. They have about the right amount of stratification in them. You don't want things that are too complicated, and you don't want things that are too simple. You want to have about this amount of stratification. Now, I think one of you guys had said, well, it seems like it could be kind of rigid, because if you use all of the diagonals and then you just use the subdivisions that you get, that the grid is going to be the same, no matter who does it. And that's true. But that's true of any grid. If you look at a square grid, on a 9, a 3x4 grid or whatever, that's the grid everyone uses, right? So it's not as though this grid makes anything particularly, that's what I'm looking for. In other words, anybody can design the grid. It's how you use it that matters, okay? So here, grid on or grid off, and this was project 3. And if you did the work on any project, you would have a lot of studies, you'd have a lot of written content, you'd have everything that you need. Here, even using some of the content from the layouts as content in the spread. And something else I want to say is that I don't want you to redesign the project. The project is already done. You're going to use the study layouts and the final layouts as your content. It's not like you're rethinking the wheel here. You're just, using the content that already exists for what you're going to use in your grid. And like I said, you can still pick up stuff from the content of the project and use those as elements. Here, the same idea with a graphic element in the spread as a graphic element in the actual, spread of this project. And even the type from the project is repeated here. So that's all fine. Pull quotes from the content of the project, that's fine too. I mean, I want you to be creative with this. I don't want you to feel like you're sort of locked in and you can't do anything with it. I want you to feel like you can really play around with this. In this case, a lot of the content is the same size. I don't really have a problem with that. Just remember that sometimes contrast is a good thing. And, having 1 or 2 really big elements and some small stuff in support, that's always a viable option, okay? And here's with the grid on, you can see how nicely this works. Remember also that the grid this is an active formal grid, Okay, do not use it in an inactive manner, because you'll just negate the purpose of this grid in the first place. What's beautiful about the grid is the module and the spatial zone shapes that it creates, and that's what makes it cool. So in order to use this grid actively, 3 sides must hit the grid. If a fourth one hits, awesome, but it may not. And so, what you're doing is, 3 sides hit, and then 1 side may not. Okay, so that's the idea here. You're going to be using this grid actively. All right, so that's the concept behind the project. And then what this project didn't have, I changed the spec after this particular class was done, but I want you to have a title page that talks about Project 4 Dynamic Grid or something like that. And if you go back to the sample projects, you'll see several projects in those samples where that title page exists. I just wanted to use this one as an example because it's so well done. The grid is really good, and she really followed the directions really, really well. And the design all by itself is good. Remember, most of you guys have typography. Don't forget that. Use good creative type. Think about what you can do with all kinds of neat things that you know. Okay, so have some fun.